All right, so we're going to talk about risk management. If any of you who have sat through my risk management presentations previously, this is a little bit different. I'll cover a lot of the same topics and a lot of things, but this one is different because it's story time. And that's what I'll do is I will go through and to the best of my ability answer any of your questions. So I want to make sure that you ask questions. If you have a question about something, ask me. I'm happy to answer it. I'm going to answer it with two things. It's mostly going to be US based. I do work internationally, so I do understand some of the international laws and how things are interpreted and that kind of stuff, but also from our perspective. Because an important thing to remember is that risk management is a strategy that each agency uses, and each agency strategy can be different. So the information that I give you is going to be from our perspective, how we would do things, how we would guide you through a process, but that doesn't mean it works for every single agency. The other thing I typically ask is if there are any attorneys or insurance people in the crowd, but there probably are. So you might be offended or disagree with some of the things that I say, and that's all right, because that's what brings up discussion and helps us learn. So anyways, here we are, how this presentation started. So I often go down in our instructor trainer workshops. I'll just sit in on them, and we'll have our ITEs. We have several of them in the room here today. And they're the ones who run our ITWs. And in this particular one, we were at Chapman's in a pool. And the pool, we had a fairly big group, and we couldn't fit everybody in the pool. So what I did to fill the time was I just sat out on the deck and said, look, the half of the class that's out there, just ask me questions. If there's something you want to know, I'm going to answer them for you. I'm going to answer them. I'm going to give you kind of in-depth theory and strategy as to what we do, why we do it, and how it best serves you. So that's how that happened. So I'm asking you to do the same thing. If there's a question that you have, something that you're thinking of, ask during this presentation. I have some points that I'll be covering, which will hopefully spark some thought, and it'll give me something to start talking about, and then you just chip in at any time, and I'll be happy to answer that. After I'm finished with mine, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron from Chapman, and he's going to talk about dive boats. And the reason why that is so important to us is because it's probably 85–90% of our activity is done off of dive boats. And as a formerly licensed captain, I used to hold a 100-ton U.S. master's license and a 500-ton international license. I worked on liveaboards for 5 years. It's pretty amazing to see what some boat captains do and what they're getting away with. Some of it's in the name of customer service. Some of it's a complete lack of understanding. Some of it's trying to increase revenue, and he can answer those questions for you on the do's and don'ts. So I'm not going to step any more into that. I'll let you take over once we get there, because he understands those regulations better than I do. So everything we do in life has a risk. This is one of the things I always talk about when I'm doing the presentations, but I found a quote from Anthony Bourdain, who actually applied it to food, which I thought was great. My normal example is you can lay in bed or sit around and get bed sores and muscle atrophy, and so you're still at risk. Even if you're not exposing yourself to risks, you still have a risk. But the way he put it to food, I thought was a great thing. Can anybody read that? Yeah. All right, so what he says is, I've long believed that good food, good eating is all about risk. Whether we're talking about unpasteurized Stilton, raw oysters, or working for organized crime associates, food for me has always been an adventure. So there you go. Even food, eating food, good food is a risk. I like my good food. So some of the risk exposures, talk about those. Activities. One of the things that people oftentimes misunderstand about liability releases and how that works and why we need to inform people of all these things and get them to sign this and do a proper briefing, dive briefings and those kind of things, is about the activity. Everything in the legal world has to be activity specific. You have to acknowledge that this is the activity that we are partaking in, and these are the risks associated with that activity. And that includes everything we do, from marine life identification to deep diving, to CCR diving, to travel. The travel waivers, when I first started in the industry, were a pretty simple one-page travel waiver. Some of the ones I'm looking at now are 10 to 14 pages long. And because you have to identify the risks, you are bringing these people from the United States or wherever you're coming from to another place And along the way, there are risks associated with that. That could be kidnapping, it could be hostage, it could be exposure to diseases, to any number of things. And they have to, as a consumer, have a reasonable expectation of safety. And part of that is an acknowledgement of the risks and an opportunity to get out of those risks if they don't want to. So that's what, when I talk about activities, people oftentimes say, well, I see this liability release, can I use it for shark diving activities? No, you cannot, because that does not cover the person going from the boat to the cage and what could happen since you've chummed the waters to get these sharks in here. That's a completely different activity. We have to identify the risks and identify the activity. That's why all of our releases are very specific. If you're an SDI, TDI member, you know that we have one that covers most of them. We have one that covers specifically solo diving, and then we have others that are for just various other things, snorkeling, boat diving, guided, non-guided, those kind of things. Okay? So activity specific is a very important one. Health. This is something, and we're going to talk in just a minute, I'm going to tell you in just a minute. Health is something that we oftentimes see in most of the incidents and accidents. Now, health is an odd thing because oftentimes when we start with the dive professionals, you're going along, you have a pretty good idea how you feel, you're pretty self-aware, but health issues still crop up. Divers oftentimes have the same thing. They don't know the stress their body is getting ready to go under, though. They have no idea. And oftentimes we see that dives will start in a pretty benign situation, low current, good visibility, surface conditions are flat. Those things all change in the middle of a dive. They get a current, you get surface conditions that get bad, you get visibility gets disrupted, all those stressors start adding up, which creates a response to the body. And then the body does things. It can create decompression, increased decompression risks. There's any number of things that happen. Oftentimes, people don't even realize what's going to happen. And a lot of the fatalities that we see are attributed to health. They're health issues that even the diver themselves were not aware of. They didn't even realize they had them. Sometimes they do. I'll talk about some strategies that we use and how they work as well. Environmental conditions. This is a big one, and we're seeing this more and more often. We're seeing this in the form of ratios. You'll notice in some of our standards a couple years ago, we started putting in environmental factors because I think the industry has failed in some respects when it comes to ratios for courses, not identifying that ratio is based on the best possible conditions. You have clear waters, you have calm conditions, this is the maximum number of students that you can take in the water as a dive professional. If any of those things change, including the students themselves, so the students, you may have young students, you may have a diver with ADD, you may have ADHD, there's any number of things that they can have, but they require more attention than so that means you have to reduce your ratios so that you're not trying to pay attention to 4 students, you're paying attention to 3 students because one of them's a little higher maintenance. So those are factors. Visibility. If you take 7 people in the water at a time, if you're sitting in the middle of those 7, can you see all the divers on either side of you? Maybe not. So then you reduce the ratio to where you can. Some people use the rule of, can I touch them all? That's kind of a hard rule to follow because then you're probably never going to go over about 3 divers in any course that you ever teach. And even then, if you're at the far end of a line, if you're in a line, you're probably not going to be able to reach the diver on the other end. So that's not always the best rule. It's a great rule. And if you can do that and things work out, perfect. 2-to-1 ratios is always a good one. But I myself, I've been teaching, I've been in the industry for 30 years and over 30 years now, and I don't think I've ever taken the full complement. And generally, I feel comfortable around a 4-to-2 ratio. I have 4 divers with me and a dive master or an assistant instructor. That's always how I operated. And then if I brought in more students, I bring in more assistants. But I never tried to do full complements. That always made me a little nervous. First cave course I ever took. I was thinking about becoming a cave instructor, taught by a really great instructor, and went in there, and it was just 2 of us in the water with the instructor. After the 3rd or 4th dive in the cave system, I'm like, that's it. I've reached my instructor limits. I'm never being a cave instructor. Because even at a 2-to-1 ratio, that was more fun than I wanted to have. So I was done. I'm going to stay a student at this level, and that's where I'll be. So environmental conditions are something we really need to pay attention to as dive professionals. What are they when we start, and how do they affect us during the dive, and are they changing? Because that could mean you're going to end the dive early. Just because you planned a 1-hour dive, 30 minutes into it, storm kicks up, surface conditions are bad, that means getting back on board a boat, if you're diving a boat, is not going to be the same as what you thought it was going to be. You need to end that dive early. Don't just do it because that's what you planned. Do it based on the conditions and change them, because they will change on you. Social media. This is probably our biggest threat right now. It's what causes a lot of dive centers and a lot of instructors to do things they wouldn't normally do because they feel that social pressure of, why does that dive center look like they're doing so great? They've always got divers in the water. They're constantly putting people in there. They must be doing something really well. And I've got to increase my business. So how we see that coming out, and we see this in a quality assurance process, we see course fees starting here, lowering course fees to get more people in, lowering them a little bit more to make it look to get more students in. And then all of a sudden the little light turns on and goes, well, wait a minute, my course fee isn't as high, and I'm putting all this time and money into it. I've got to somehow shave this down. I've got to shorten my pool times. I have to shorten my open water dives. I have to shorten my classroom time. Whatever it is, they start cutting corners. That ultimately leads to an incident or an accident. And that all comes because somebody else was posting all these divers that they've got in the water, all these people in there. They may be doing the same exact amount of business as you, but they're just better at the social media side of it. Or they have somebody else out there taking pictures. And then they're taking a 30-second video. Brian's presentation was just talking about little 30-second videos. They shoot a 30-second video of that class, and then they shoot another 30-second video of the same exact class, and then they just keep releasing those things at different times, but it's the same class. They're just more creative, which makes it look like they're doing more business. So social media, what we're finding is that creates issues. It creates a risk. It's a risk factor because the other people around them get the perception that they're doing much better. And we all know everybody has a social media life, and then we have real life. And anybody who posts their real life on social media probably doesn't have a lot of followers. All right. Some of the things that we do to mitigate our risk. Dive professionals and divers. Dive professionals, you are the second step in the process of managing risks. You're the one who knows what the risk should be, whatever that level of course may be. You understand it. Brian used a good example in his presentation talking about asking a diver, why do you want to take this course? What's the why behind what you're doing? In his example, he said it was to get a plate off a wreck. There's probably better ways to do that. I mean, sure, that's a goal. You can do that. I myself had divers say, because I wanted to see depth on a computer. Well, let's just float out in there, and you can tie it off on a reel and drop it down and pull it back up. And then you'll see depth on a computer. But interviewing them, understanding the risks, and understanding that you're teaching the right person for the right reasons. You're the second step in it. The reason why I say you're the second step is because the diver is the first step. They need to feel comfortable in what they are doing. They are part of that risk mitigation strategy. If that diver seems like they're nervous, they're not prepared, whatever it is, and this is a consultation with them maybe, is that, you know, we brought you in to do this dive and you still seem like you're a little nervous. Maybe we have to spend some more time doing shallow dives. Maybe we have to spend more time in the pool. Maybe we need to spend more time just relaxing and breathing. It's all those things to get them to be comfortable. That's not saying it has to be done for free. It just means that you've got to spend more time building their comfort in the water. Don't rush them on the same schedule. They may not fit into that same category as every other diver that I brought through here. They can do this dive, go in here and do these pool sessions. If you're doing a CCR, they can get in there 120 minutes or whatever it is in a pool, and then drop them into the open water, and they can do their open water dives, and they've got another 300 minutes in open water, and then they're ready to go. This diver may require 400 minutes in a pool to get comfortable on a rebreather, and then another 700 minutes in open water to get them to a comfort level. You're still going to get paid for your services, but you need to be aware of that, and they need to be self-aware that they're not comfortable yet. There's always going to be a little bit of jitters. They're going to be nervous. That's just normal. But understanding that threshold of what is too much is very important to them. We see that all the time. Divers panic. Typically, panic means a few things. It means that you've pegged out their fun meter. They're having more fun than they should be having, and now the mind starts not thinking right, and you put them into a bad situation. Rapid ascents, regulators coming out, over-breathing regulators, all those things, all those little indicators. It's time to stop. Go up to the surface, reset, figure out what the new plan is. Okay, so divers are an important part of that. Make sure they are aware of that. Waivers. This is one of our proactive tools that we use. I already talked about those a little bit. Waivers are really informed consent. That means that they are activity specific, right? We've told them about the activity. We've told them about the risks that are associated with that activity, and they have accepted those risks. This can be different from different parts of the world. In the US, it's a fairly straightforward process, not as straightforward as in the UK and other countries that have a really, you decided you wanted to do this, you're on your own now. That's how simple theirs is. The US, we use it as a way to get verification that this person read this information and they signed and dated it, so they're accepting it. Very powerful tools. If used right, if filled in properly, they're extremely powerful. We win. Winning a lawsuit is it's never really a win, but reducing the amount of time and money invested into a lawsuit these waivers have helped us tremendously on those things. Medical screening, this goes back to the health aspect of it. Another proactive approach. Oftentimes this is a self-declaration. With us, until you get into the professional levels, then it does require a physician sign-off or a PA sign-off. And they can sign off saying, yes, this person has been medically screened and cleared to dive. With divers, for the most part, it means that this person is going through and saying no to everything that's on there if they don't have any indications. But you can also be made aware of a medical condition simply by visual or by spoken. They use some form of inhaler, a nebulizer, they've got asthma, didn't check off on their medical form. You are now aware of that. You need to stop it wherever they are, and you have to make sure they go and get a physician sign-off. Diabetics, if you see them doing anything, insulin, CGM monitors, those kind of things on them that they didn't disclose on it, you've got to put them into a doctor. A physician needs to sign off on that. Not everything in health means that they're going to be stopped, but it does mean it needs to be checked out by somebody. And that helps us. These other two tools here are also transfers of liability, because now we're going with the waivers. The diver has acknowledged that they understand the risks and they've had an opportunity to stop if they didn't want to assume those risks. So you've transferred some of that liability back on the participant themselves. When it comes to the medical questionnaire, same thing. If this is a self-declared one, they just have to fill out a screening document. They can now, they have put on their medical forms that nothing is wrong with them. They're perfectly healthy. If a physician signature was required, you've now transferred that over to the physician, because now the physician has taken it based on their medical knowledge and said, yes, this individual is capable of diving. Or no, they're not. They're not capable of diving. The goal with the medical is really the health of the diver. We're trying to protect them and keep them safe. And health screening is one of those steps that we have to do that with. This is also an area where we see a lot of issues. We have had many cases where an individual ends up getting really injured or worse. Come to find out, they have lied on all of their medical screening documents. And then once their primary care physicians are consulted with, they're like, no, this has been a known issue. We've got all this documented in there. But consumers get educated on these things, just like we do in the liability release waivers. How many of you, at your stage in your career in diving, have seen so many waivers that when you go in there, you just go, yep, I know what this is. Yes? we can be truthful in here. There's nothing, no recordings, right? It happens. Consumers are the same way. They know that if they come down to store A and want to take a dive class, all they want to do is go scuba diving, and they fill out the form and it has a yes on there, And now you look back at them and you say, okay, I see you've indicated a yes on here. I'm going to need you to go to your doctors. They're immediately tallying in their head, I've got to take a day off of work. It's going to take me 3 months to get that appointment. It's going to cost me this amount of money. I'm going to go to dive shop B down the street and not answer yes. They become educated. That's what we do. Just like the rest of us in this room with the liability release waivers, we know what that waiver says. We know what it's supposed to do. We're educated on that. We just go ahead and go through the process. Fingers crossed everything goes right, and we don't have to worry about it. Standards. Standards are interesting. We're going to have a presentation on how standards are developed. There's a lot that goes into them. I'm only going to speak for how we do that. But what we do with standards is we develop standards so that it's, sometimes it irritates, especially divers. It definitely irritates dive professionals with our system. Our goal is to train people at that level. We're not going to try to overtrain them. We're not going to try to undertrain them. We're going to train them to be proficient at that level. Then we want them to go to get experience at what they were just taught. So they're gaining their own experience. There's a lot of value in that. Just going out and doing the dives, getting in the water, spending the time in the water, and practicing the skills that you just learned before you go up to the next level. Running through the courses is usually never a good thing because it's too much. It becomes task loading. It instills this level of confidence that is not rightly placed. They need to take time and spend time there, especially when you get into the technical levels. Brian was talking about courses in our system that go to 150 feet. The next course is a 200 and something foot course. If you've never broken 150 feet and then gone down to 300 feet, there are some levels in there that are big changes. They are huge jumps. It seems like it's linear, like, well, you know, I did it at 200 feet, I should be able to do it at 275. Nope, it's not how that works. It's a completely different world. So our system is designed to try to slow down that pace. That's how we develop standards. And we're constantly evolving when it comes to standards. We're always looking at them. We take every one of our incidents, every one of our accidents. If it's related to us, we have a lot of details on them. If it's with another agency, we don't hold that against that other agency. We use it, we take it in, we run it through our training department, and we go, we look at this, analyze the accident with the information that we have, and we say, is there something in our standards that could have been changed that would have prevented this? Is there something in our materials that we could add that would have prevented this? If the answer is no, we don't make any changes. If the answer is yes, we make those changes. Because I'm going to talk about here, we have 3 different sets of standards. We have the agency standards, which I just talked about. We have the industry standard, which is typically like your RSTC or ISO standards. And then we have personal standards. Industry standards also include what you guys are doing in the field. And like a lot of things in life, what you do in the field and the techniques that you develop are often ahead of what an agency is doing. So you're developing a good practice in the field that is working over and over again. Another dive professional sees it and is like, that's really clever. And that looks like it accomplishes things in a very efficient way, makes a better diver. So then that gets passed over to that next professional and so on and so forth. 6 or 7 months later, or even a year later, an agency learns about it, like us, and we take that information and we try to incorporate it into our standards because it becomes a good procedure. So oftentimes you guys are putting things out there and we're learning from you and then incorporating those good practices into standards. Personal standards are the next level higher from that. This may be that you say, I know that an open water course only requires 4 open water dives. I'm not going to do one for less than 6 dives. Everyone is going to require 6 dives. Personal example, advanced nitroxin deco procedures, when I used to teach that, we used to be able to teach it with 6 dives. It was if you combine the 2 courses, you could do it in 6 dives. I never did that. Frustrated a lot of the divers that I trained because the first 2 dives I did with them was essentially an intro to tech course. We weren't going deeper than 30 feet of water. And we were running through skills. I was getting the buoyancy, the trim, the propulsion, everything else down before they even saw deep waters. They're expecting to jump in the water and do a 150-foot dive with me. Not going to happen. I don't know you. I don't know where you're at right now. I'm not taking you to that depth. We're going to spend 2 dives, so 2.5 to 3 hours, in 25 to 30 feet of water going through skills. And you're going to learn where everything is. And after each one of those dives, we're going to come up and look at your equipment. I'm going to ask you about your muscle responses. How did you feel? Did you figure out where your reel was? Did you figure out where your backup reel was? Were you able to deploy your lift bags? Do you feel comfortable in deploying lift bags? All those things happened in 25 to 30 feet of water, and they did a minimum of 8 dives. Even though they knew they had a credit where they only had to do 6, I still made them do 8. That was my personal standard. I could have shortened it by 2 dives, but I didn't. So personal standards are another level up, typically. That's our experience. And I'm not suggesting to overteach people. You don't need to do that, because that also gives a sense of I can do more, because now I know more. So I don't need to take that next course. You don't want to do that. Make them very solid at the level that they're at. Give them the information that they need where they're at, because it's still a lot. You always want to think about task loading when it comes to skills and knowledge, because fatigue will set in and some of that stuff is going to not be heard or remembered. Any questions so far? Because I've been talking and I told you this is going to be interactive and haven't given you an opportunity. Nothing? All right, there you go. Materials, also a proactive approach. Similar to standards, we do material updates occasionally. Oftentimes it's imagery that we replace in there. If it's an online course, it may be videos and static images that we replace in there just because the equipment lines go out of date, things look old, those kind of things. The content typically doesn't change that much. We're pretty fortunate in that way that a lot of the stuff, especially in the technical side, in the early days, things were changing rapidly. We were constantly learning new things about it. I first started diving SCRs, and if anybody remembers these days with the dragers, they didn't have flow gauges, so we had these yellow bags that, I don't know how many dives I had on a drager SCR before I realized what that yellow bag was for. I didn't even think about flow rates. I knew that each orifice that I hooked up to had a certain flow rate, but I didn't know how to measure that. So then the materials caught up, because the first materials were in German. Finally, someone translated them, and I struggled with English, and there was no way I was reading German at the same time. So materials caught up, and we're like, oh, that's what that does. And then we got flow gauges, and then we got all kinds of things that came along with that. So in the early days of technical diving, a lot of things evolved really fast. Now we're in a pretty good position where it doesn't happen. There are some new things. We mostly see it in the CCR field right now that's coming out with gas densities and PO2s and things like that. They're starting to get more defined stuff. Our industry struggles with getting, if you're in the scientific world, we struggle with really getting good scientific data sets. We're not getting 10,000 samples out of any one thing anytime soon. So it takes us a while to catch up with that. So as far as our materials are concerned, we do update them based on new things that we learn. We definitely do a lot of translations to make sure that people are learning in their native language. Makes it better, more efficient learning for them. So that's one thing that we do. We release, anytime we release something now, something new, it comes out in 8 languages as our first set of languages, and then we do another 8 languages after that. So in the end, it'll have 16 total languages that it's been translated into for anything. So materials is another proactive approach. This is also a way to transfer. Remember I was talking about the health screening is transferring liability back to the user, back to the physician possibly. Waivers are transferring it back to the individual who's filling out the waiver. Materials do the same thing, but they transfer it back to us. That's our responsibility. If we put something out there and you use it as an instructor, dive master, assistant instructor, instructor trainer, then that content belongs to us. We inform that user of that content, whether it's a manual or online. That is coming back to us. So you can say, I just used what they gave me, and that's a transfer back to us. So it's not always transferring it outside of other people. Prudent actions. This is a big one. This goes back to those environmental factors. Paying attention as a professional to what's going on around you, and is this the right time to be doing this and the right place to be doing this? And are these the right divers to be doing this with? Because sometimes that's the key. Not everybody should be a diver. Not everybody belongs in a group. Sometimes we have to reduce that ratio so that we can get them down into smaller groups that are more manageable. And then they can accomplish, they can be successful in it, but they require more attention. And that's just the reality of the situation. So you can't just always say, I'm going to put 6 people in this class, or I'm going to put 8 people in this class, or I'm going to have my full complement of 4 CCR divers on every class, because it's not always going to work. Maybe it's the conditions that need to you reduce that, maybe it's the divers, but you have to be paying attention to those things and adjust accordingly. And this was an interesting quote that I saw. I'll read this one too. I don't know who the guy is, but it's a great quote. It says, stand on the top of a cliff and jump off and build your wings on the way down. That, as weird as that sounds, that happens more than you would think in dive instructors. They go out there and start teaching a class and they're like, oh, TDI standards suck. They don't know what's going on. They're behind the times. I'm just going to make some little tweaks here and this is how I'm going to train my diver. Guess who just became a training agency? The instructor did. Because as soon as you modify our standards, and this applies to any agency, as soon as you start going off script and deciding that you know better and you're changing the standards or the requirements of the standards, you are the training agency. So, and I will tell you, in 25 years of working for a training agency, don't start a training agency. It's a long, exhausting process that takes forever. And there's a lot involved with it. And even though we do have standards, and I agree, there's updates to standards that need to be done annually, which we do, we also have a mechanism for change. You can submit something to us and say, this is the situation that I have. We'll look at that and we'll say, you know what, that applies globally. That's a great thing. We can implement those standards. Here's when it's going to be implemented. Here's a waiver until that implementation is done. Or we say, that's a really good idea, but it only applies to your situation. Here's a waiver that is geographically specific to you that allows you to do the course like that because you've made a great argument and we agree with you. It just doesn't apply to the rest of the world. And I'll give you some examples of what we've had to do. Many years ago, trimix. We had a trimix course. It was pretty clear to me that trimix meant you had a helium-based gas that was in that course. We had members saying, oh, no, I do the dives all on air. Well, why? Well, because it doesn't say I have to use helium. Yeah, but that's the whole purpose. Okay, we're going to put a minimum percentage of helium in there now. Then they didn't like that, and they're like, but the depths are too deep. Well, if you can't reach that depth, why are you teaching the course? If you can't get below 200 feet, don't teach an advanced trimix course. But they would do it. They would do advanced trimix courses in 150 feet of water, 200 feet of water, because, that's where the bottom was. They couldn't get any deeper. So we had to rule some of that stuff out, unfortunately. But that's where the jumping off, let me just start teaching this course and then I'll figure out how to do it as I go along. That's where that quote resonated with me. All right, any questions so far? Yes?
You say you need a waiver for it, but would you need a waiver for it? Just don't teach it. It almost sounds like it's backwards. Like,
I'm not following.
I don't ice dive.
Yeah.
Why would I need a waiver for it? I guess, can I have an example of where you would need a waiver?
For any course you're teaching, you should have a waiver. Or an activity that you're participating in. Let's say you're going out and you're just guiding divers in the water. You're not training them. You're not doing anything like that.
Right.
We have a waiver for that. But the waiver clearly states you are not training. You are just in the water with them, guiding them on a dive, but it doesn't have any training implications to it.
I think you're meaning a waiver that applies for training deviating from standards.
Oh, that kind of waiver. That kind of waiver. Okay.
But if you need a waiver, wouldn't you just not teach? I guess I don't know what an example would be.
I'm going to bite my tongue on my first response probably was not appropriate. So let's see an example of a waiver. I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head. I don't have any of my. Oh, you.
Lagoon in Key Largo. For a little while, it wasn't considered an open water dive because it was so confined and it's just a lagoon, right? But on super wavy days, we can't always take students out to the reef. So, and the only way they can really get a certification is by going to Jules Lagoon. So the standards were actually changed 25 feet deep and you spend at least 20 minutes, then it's considered open water. But
Right.
for a little while there, Jules Lagoon actually had like a special waiver that was given that was like, okay, this counts as open water just at Jules Lagoon, even though technically at the time it didn't meet those standards.
Right, which is a good example, and if you think about that, if you look at it, how much different is that than a spring? And a spring is considered an open water dive too. Or a quarry. You've got a small quarry. I mean, I used to teach classes, and in Texas, they've got all these little clay pit quarries that are there, and they're just a big pond. They're less of an open water environment than Jules Lagoon is. At least it has tidal, sort of tidal flow that comes in and out of there. But that is a good example. Thank you. But yeah, so that would be an example of something that we would say, well, that applies. It makes sense, and we can work with it. All right, that's all I have. I'm going to turn it over to Aaron, unless you guys have any questions. Oh, because he's only got 20 minutes. Whoops, I used up all your time, Aaron. That was your fault for the feedback little thing that you did, Aaron.
I'm sorry.
All right, so
I'm not checked out on this model of microphone, you know?
So Aaron is with Chapman. Great resource. We're happy to have this partnership with them because they do bring all the expertise when it comes to dive boats and their knowledge on boats and U.S. Coast Guard regulations and other things. You can challenge him with international regulations. I encourage that.
Thanks, Sean.
You're welcome. Thank you.
With friends like that. Right? Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name's, like Sean said, my name's Aaron Zimmer. I am the Director of Training and Education at the Chapman School of Seamanship. If you're not familiar with us, we are a nonprofit educational activity. We've over a course of 50 plus years, we've focused on trying to make safer boaters and make more competent captains. So we do everything from captain's license courses up to 200-ton master. We do recreational programs, and we also do, over the summer, we do a youth program where we get 250-ish kids from age 11 to 17 out on the water and run through their National Safe Boating Council certification so they can get their safer boater card. So we want to try to start them early. So, yeah, thanks for being here this late in the afternoon. I know I'm probably standing between you and a pint, so we'll get through this. But just really quick to talk about boating safety in general, really, and then how it applies to the dive industry. So just a couple pictures there. You've probably seen these before. On the left is the Conception, which that tragic event out in California a few years back. I think it was about 28 folks perished in that. And then on the right is a vessel called the Southern Comfort, which was out of, I think, Palm Beach area a few years back. Dude just got some COVID money, decided he was going to buy a sport fisher and turn it into a dive boat. And unfortunately, he wound up killing somebody with that boat. So a lot of times I think when we talk boating safety in regards to this activity, it's really easy to look at these egregious examples and say, oh, they should have done this, they shouldn't have done that. This would have helped prevent that from occurring. But it's more like, how do we, on that smaller level, get ahead of that error chain, right, to prevent that from happening? So my background is, I was in the Coast Guard for 33 years, so that's how I look at a lot of this boating safety type lens, right? There's if you ever heard the term the Swiss cheese model, where it's all these little things that just one thing by itself might not lead to an incident or a death or an injury, but when you start stacking them on top of each other, the holes in the Swiss cheese line up, and it allows for that activity to happen. So how do we kind of get ahead of those errors and identify them and practice safer boating before it gets to this point where we all look back and say, well, that's a no-brainer. They did this and it resulted in that. So that's how I kind of would like to approach it a little bit, talking about the safety. So when we started looking at this, one of the things that became clear very quickly is it's really hard to get comprehensive statistics on how many accidents are really occurring out there for a couple reasons. Okay, the Coast Guard does not regulate the dive industry. So it views your regular dive boat that you go out on is just classified as a small passenger vessel. There's no separate category in federal law that says a dive boat has to do this. On the commercial side, when you talk commercial diving operations like oil rigs and the gas fields like Gulf of Mexico type of stuff, it does, the Coast Guard does regulate that. They will go out, they will look at, decompression chambers, they'll look at all kinds of stuff. But just on a boat that is going out, say from, the Orlando, I know there's no water here, right? Orlando Dive Shop, we'll just use a generic name. They don't categorize that separately. It's just deemed a small passenger vessel. So the statistics are based on just small passenger vessel reporting requirements for marine casualties, which is pretty broad. It has to be something very bad. What I could find with Dan, for example, is they will track live aboard, but it's hard to find published numbers about things short of serious incidents on a live aboard. I've looked at the National Transportation Safety Board. If you Google dive accident, NTSB, thank you. The first thing comes up is the Titan, the submersible over on the Titanic. It's nothing about diving. And then the Coast Guard one is, like I said, very high level. So I put in 10-year search. You can look at Coast Guard incident reports, and only 54 things come up. And most of them are groundings, elisions, collisions, things like that. So really hard to find that, and not a lot of information on what we would call a near miss. Like, how long does a diver have to be floating and not found to get recorded somewhere? It's really hard to try to classify that. There really isn't a standard. But looking through some of the annual DAN report and the BSAC report, I think a new one just was released within the last couple weeks. I'm kind of looking at some of the causes, and some of the commonalities were the equipment, both dive equipment that the divers had, but then what I would say equipment on a vessel. Like batteries is a huge issue. Lithium-ion batteries, like plugging in and people daisy chaining chargers together, or power strips. So it looks like, on Christmas Story, when Ralphie's dad is plugging in the Christmas tree, it's just chain. Older boats are not designed to carry the load of so many electronics. Because, everybody goes aboard now. What do they have? Lights, cameras, dive computers, their cell phones. If it's overnight, they probably brought iPads. Now they're wireless headsets that they're plugging in. All these things are getting plugged in. Just look, anybody been on a cruise lately, on a cruise ship? If you've been, I went on one out of, I won't say the brand, but you probably know, it's out of Palm Beach and goes to the Bahamas. All right? That is an old, we'll call it a legacy cruise ship. On there. But you go into those old cruise ships, and you're lucky if you have 2 plugs. All right? You go on a new one, and they're set up. They've got all the different, USB ports, a ton of electrical outlets. It is designed with that activity in mind. Older boats were not designed with that. The conception, they had a lot of lithium-ion batteries plugged in, among other things, on there that led to a fire. Okay, mechanical failures on the boat or on boats. Dive boats can be a tough thing mechanically. Because they are scheduled so many times, morning and afternoon, 7 days a week. However, the thing that, everybody relies on, if you don't take the time to take it down and make sure the maintenance is done and stay ahead of it, can break down or have an issue at the worst possible moment. Especially if you combine it with heading offshore, I don't know if I call it human, maybe another category, weather. Pushing the envelope on putting people in the water, 6 to 8 foot seas, we'll say. People doing that, you've got a mechanically unreliable boat in heavy seas, you're asking for challenges. When I was in the Coast Guard, one of my first search and rescue cases was a dive boat up in North Carolina that had blown its windows out because they were out in 8 foot coming back in. So they're taking on water coming back in. Medical, I heard Sean talking about medical checks. I'm not a really experienced diver. I just did my kind of refresher course, and I followed the rules because I'm getting old. So I went and got my medical done. I was all proud. I got my form. I got it in triplicate. It's like, I am set. I am ready to show this to somebody. And the dive instructor's just like, cool, get on the boat. Well, what about this? You look good. And I'm like, what is this? But anywho, nobody asked about that. But, making sure that that those are taken care of. And then what I would call human factors, just plain human error, that does occur. People crews not knowing how to necessarily use equipment. Maybe they're not practiced enough in emergency response to deal with an incident when it comes up. And I realize, some boats can have a lot of turnover, and they have multiple crews that are operating this boat because they're scheduled so many times. How are we making sure that the training and the familiarization and the proficiency of those folks is up to where it needs to be so that they run a safe operation, run a safe boat, and make sure, at the end of the day, right, we want the same number to come back that went out, and hopefully in the same condition that they left in, or better trained, we'll say. Regulation-wise, like I mentioned, about the federal side, I looked up, I'm using state of Florida, and I'm using U.S. boats for this. Okay, I realize that different jurisdictions will have different requirements. The state, what I could find, most of the time, all the state regulations, all they mention is dive flags. Florida, all I could find was you got to have a dive flag. And how many, 100 feet if you're inland, 300 feet offshore, you're supposed to go slow on it. So the state wasn't much help on that one. Not knocking it, just that's kind of the reality of it. Requirements for these boats are in the Code of Federal Regulations, right? Everybody loves a law. 46 CFR, and then there's multiple subsections. And I just put them up here. Subchapter C, H, K, and T. You can just Google it. All that refers to is each type of boat has a chapter, if you will, in the Code of Federal Regulations. So subchapter C is uninspected passenger vessels. So that is boats that have 6 passengers or fewer. All right. H is just a passenger vessel over 100 tons. K is a small passenger vessel that is 100 tons or less that carries more than 150 people or 49 with overnight accommodations. And then subchapter T is small passenger vessel under 150 passengers and under 49 overnight. So the majority of the boats that I have seen that I'm experienced with kind of fall in that T, that small passenger vessel right there. So those requirements drive the required equipment. So if it is an inspected passenger vessel, it's going to have a certificate of inspection from the U.S. Coast Guard, right? So it gets inspected annually. It's going to say how many life jackets you need, how many fire extinguishers you need, where they have to be, how many life rings, if you need a life float, all of the different safety equipment that is on board. So the manning of that vessel is also contained in that certificate of inspection. It'll say most of these small passenger vessels, the T-boat, will say something like the certificate will say 1 master and 1 deckhand. Okay, the deckhand is an unlicensed crew member. Okay, they all have to be enrolled in a drug consortium. We don't want somebody that's coked up out there taking care of, bong hits in the parking lot before we get underway. But they have to, they be in that consortium. And that fact that crew member that is not licensed does not mean they are untrained. There is something the Coast Guard puts out called a NAVIC, NVIC, Navigation Vessel Inspection Circular. So the NAVIC 1TAC91, and that's Googleable. I just verbified that word, but it lists what the training is for a small passenger vessel deckhand. So it's basically you have to be trained crew on everything emergency response related. So how do you handle fire? How do you handle taking on water? How do you abandon ship? Okay. How you take care and anything else that they may need to do with regards to their duties. So the marine employer, whoever owns the boat and is responsible for crewing the boat and getting it underway, is supposed to train those people once they're hired, before they get underway, and every 3 months after that. That's in the Code of Federal Regulations. What I have seen before, and in full disclosure, I've not worked on a dive boat, but I've worked on a small passenger vessel, is especially when you have multiple people working on a crew, is it's really easy for someone to fall through the cracks. And you might be logging, you're doing drills every 3 months, but on a boat I was on, I look back, I'm like, wait a minute, you're only hitting like 10% of the crew is getting this training. So you would have deckhands that had gone a year and never done an actual drill on how to handle an emergency. To the level of, we had a removable ladder to get people out of the water. When I said, how do you work that? And they go, I don't know, I've never done it. I mean, what? Somebody's gonna get in a bad spot because we're not doing that. So that training then leads into the drills, right? Like I said, every 3 months you're supposed to do drills. So fire, man overboard, abandoned ship is generally what's listed in there. Although I will say, within those different categories of boats, they vary just a little bit based on the size, which makes sense. And I would say is, the best practice, make sure that all the captains and crew are actually doing drills to remain proficient. And how are they also then training to handle somebody who's in the water? Because on a boat, you generally do man overboard, you pull up to them, you drag them out of the water. What about somebody that's in full dive gear that's now unconscious and you're trying to get them back on the boat? Are they trained in how to do that? Have they practiced it? Because a lot of times when you train, you might throw a fender over the side and it's like, oh, I'm going to pick it up with one hand. Well, now what if it's a 250-pound person with, what's a normal dive rig weigh? 40 pounds, 50 pounds? 70, 80, if you have all of it. So now you're trying to pull up, 320 maybe, or more? Have we practiced actually doing that? Do we have the equipment that we need to get somebody up on a boat that might have a high freeboard? All right, watches on boat just means, how many people are going to be on the boat, right? So the way most of the regulations are written is that you have to have one crew, but if you're underway for more than 12 hours, or the passengers have access to the boat for more than 12 hours, you have to have a second crew available to you, right? And the larger the boat, they'll start requiring more crew on that certificate of inspection. So now instead of just a master and a deckhand, it might say a master, a mate, and then 2 crew, something like that. So it's all on the certificate of inspection. The safety briefings. So it's funny, I started asking all my friends when they go dive, in my experience, just going there, I said, okay, you just went diving, did you go on a boat or did you do shore? They go, boat. And I said, what was your safety briefing like? Like, oh, they covered the wreck. I'm like, okay, that's your dive brief. What about the boat safety brief? And then I usually get some form of blink, 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 right? And they're like, I think they mentioned life jackets. All right, so boats may be speeding through the safety brief because we kind of sometimes have this, it's like a taxi or an Uber for someone to get out there, and is it really that kind of team that is working together, the dive professionals and the boat crew, to get somebody out there and make sure it's a safe, kind of cohesive operation? But, when people say, okay, I've got to brief you right now, and sometimes people just run through it so quick. Hey, life jackets are in that locker. Do people know how to put them on? I think sometimes there's this assumption that someone is a diver, that they're fine in the water. And the reality is probably they're half dressed in their wetsuit and their stuff is there on their way out. So, making sure real quick, it doesn't take any time to pull that actually out and show everybody what the life jacket looks like if it's needed, where they are and how they work. Same thing with fire extinguishers. There's fire extinguisher here, 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 and pointing out where all of this equipment is instead of just doing this super quick thing. Even worst case, that boat I showed the picture, the Southern Comfort, the report what I read was the morning that they got underway and someone died, the captain of that boat said, we're not Coast Guard regulated, so we don't have to do a safety briefing. That's what he said to the passengers. All right? So now, my question is, and everybody said, cool, let's go, right? So, and then reportable incidents, like I kind of mentioned that before. A Coast Guard inspected boat, and this is one of the challenges with actually trying to get a good handle on how many types of incidents or problems there are. So it's not a reportable incident to the Coast Guard unless there's a death, okay, an injury that you have to transport, so anything beyond basic first aid, more than $25,000 worth of damage to a boat. All right, so there's a lot of gray, and there's a couple other categories, but run into a bridge. All right, you intentionally or you unintentionally ground your vessel. But that's where one of those kind of challenges trying to gain or to gather statistics, because that's the reportable incident level. All right, so then we kind of get down to, all right, who's responsible for improving safety? And I think it's really kind of like it's got to be a group collective effort here. So, boat operators have a role to play, making sure the boat is maintained, make sure that we provide the proper training. We are doing the drills to make sure people are set. We're trying to partner, make sure that the boat crew and the dive professionals, the instructors, dive masters, whoever's out there, it's a kind of a team approach and not. And I realize we're talking very broad, we're painting very broad brush here, and we're talking a wide gamut. There's great operators, just like anything else. There's great operators out there, and there's ones who probably could use a little help. Making sure that the boat safety briefing complements the dive brief. When we're talking about things like, do you have audible and visual signaling devices? What is the lost diver procedures? How are you coming back up? Are the lines out? How's the rig set? Going through all of that. Divers, how about, when they're on the Southern Comfort and somebody says, we don't have to do this, maybe like, I'm not getting underway with you. Getting up and leaving, right? Same thing is like, if the dive professional, if there's a sketchy boat out there, how is that getting communicated around to either drive some change on that or make sure that people are not getting put in danger and we just don't go, all right, cool. We're still gonna go. Regulators, and by regulators, I mean state, federal, they have a role in some of that. It is kind of interesting to me as someone who teaches boating safety. If I want to go drive the 20-foot sea tow boat, I have to get an endorsement on my credential for assistance towing. But if I want to take a 75-ton boat offshore and just chuck people in the water, it's like go with God, right? Just go do your thing. So, Florida, for example, has a boating safety advisory council, and a seat is specifically set aside for dive professionals. Okay, dive industry representative. Making sure that someone who is very active and proactive in the dive industry is filling seats like that. If different states have those kind of arrangements to help bring forward issues, it's. A lot of it's people just tearing through dive areas or where dive flags are out, driving maybe some enforcement and education on the boating public to make sure they're not endangering divers by, being, bad boaters. And then I say Chapman, and it's not really just Chapman, it's how can educational, right, and boating safety entities help improve the safety both on the boats, but then in particular with diving. So that's kind of where I'm gonna leave it right now. And the pictures right here kind of go back to like hey, maybe divers, right? Like that boat. Now when I go on a boat, and maybe that's just my Coast Guard background, but it's immediately like I'm looking for the inspection sticker. I want to see. So that one on the left is we'll have it displayed. This one right here, it says U.S. Coast Guard inspected small passenger vessel. That's got to be posted. So if you can't see that, there's an issue. This lower right, that is an uninspected passenger vessel. So some small boats, right? That's a voluntary thing. But maybe we want to say if you don't have the voluntary thing, maybe we shouldn't be using it, right? Getting it looked at. And then this one upper here, that is what a master's credential looks like. If you go on a dive boat, and I'm a diver, it'd be like, hey, hey, Captain, can I see your credential? They're required to have it on board with them. Okay? So can we get it to a place where it's almost like empowering people to do that check? Say, hey, because if I go on a boat and I say, Captain, can I see your credential? And I get a hard time about it, my first instinct is like, what are you trying to hide? Why do you not want to show me your professional certification, right? So that's just a couple thoughts we had at Chapman about some boat safety, and there we go.
So, I mean, and I'll give add a little bit that we see in our incidents and accidents and stuff that comes in and stuff that I've read in it. And of course, I look at it not quite as knowledgeable as he does from the Coast Guard side, but as a captain, as a boat captain, and seeing things that I've seen. And I really can't believe them. Some of the stuff we've seen is that we'll get divers who will come back and there will be one person on board on a live boat operation. So now you have a captain who's coming back, trying to get divers out of the water. He's handling the vessel and on the fantail, trying to get the divers out of the water at the same time. Because the dive master, the other crew member, went in to do the guiding with them. That's an unsafe practice. That's not allowed. But it gets worse. We've had divers come back up on vessels and there's nobody on board.
Yeah.
There's no one. Everybody jumped in the water. Another common practice that we see, and Aaron can certainly speak to this, is in order to increase the passenger load, they'll bring divers on as crew. So they put them in on the manifest as crew members to increase the capacity, and they charge them. They're charging them as a passenger, putting them on the manifest as crew, so they can get more people on board the boat. Coast Guard has issued many, many notifications about improper first aid equipment or no first aid equipment on board a vessel, and inadequate dive supplies. As Aaron said, they don't really have there's no CFR that specifically addresses what they're supposed to have for a dive operation, but they have cited these vessels as saying you have no oxygen on board and you're 2.5 hours from shore. Or you have no first aid kit, or you have nobody trained to use the first aid equipment that you have on board. All of these things have been cited, and they're out there for people to see. We've had, those of you in Florida, how many vessels have you heard that have sank because they stern anchored into a sea? When you talk to those people, why did you stern anchor into a sea with an open fantail on this boat? Well, we weren't sure the divers could make it up to the mooring. So you stern anchored for customer service and sank your boat. Divers were sitting there watching the boat that they came out on. Bonus, you get a wreck certification for this one. Yeah. So those are the kind of things that are out there, and we really have to avoid this stuff happening. It is laughable, thankfully.
And that goes back to the training and drills, right?
Yeah.
On the proper way to do it. I don't know how many times I've searched for reports of missing divers, right? Divers adrift. Then I go back, I start thinking, I'm going, okay, what kind of lookout was that vessel maintaining? How are they watching? How are they had diver accountability? Which is a whole other thing. What manner of diver accountability is there? I've been asking. I've seen everything from people writing down like the pressures before they jump in, and then once they come back, signing names after somebody's back on board. My least favorite, just from a safety standpoint, is the verbal roll call, because somebody else could just be like, "Oh no, Bill's here," and maybe they don't say, "Oh, Bill's here." Maybe they just go, "Here," because he's like, "Oh, he just went to the head." Meanwhile, he just fell overboard, and you don't know,
Right.
and then are we setting up, from the boat, the boat crew, are they setting themselves up with how they deploy the divers, like if they're drifting, to keep more together instead of like chucking them off and everybody's swimming kind of cross current or something to get to where they're going, and now they just do this big spread out thing and go out there.
Yep. Any questions? Anything else?
I have a question.
Yes.
For Aaron, the Chapman, what's Chapman's take on safety management systems for T-boats? The Coast Guard hasn't implemented NTSB's recommendation on that airplanes implement safety management systems. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, larger vessels are required to have them. Unfortunately, sometimes the smaller vessels, the politics kind of gets in the way, and I'm not getting political, but a lot of it's driven by regulation. So in order to implement that, there has to be some kind of legal citation to do it. So they'll get it into law, just like in the CFR. I'm pointing to, because that's where the slide was. The CFR, to put it in there. However, I think most of the boats are supposed to have, what does Dan call them, EAPs, right? Something on there, which is essentially a component of safety management system. And I would say is, even if it's not required, that is a best practice to have that done, to have it down for anything that you can think of is applicable to that boat. So what are the big things that'll be applicable on a boat that we need to deal with? From the boat side, it's going to be taking on water, fire, mechanical issues, medical issues. On the dive side, you all know better than I do, but imagine it's going to be some kind of medical emergency.
Lost
diver, having that in there. So I think the more we can even get that, how do we normalize that and get everybody to have all of that broad range? I think that's what we got to work on.
Yeah, and the reason why this is so important is if you are a boat operator, and you can probably speak to this, the insurance rates are going through the roof. And some vessels just stopped operating because they couldn't afford the insurance. It was incredibly expensive. As all these things come out, think of an insurance company's perspective, the more the payout is, the higher the premium. So every time they get these multiple years of payouts, and we're talking about hurricanes, floods, whatever, fires, whatever happened, as Aaron was talking about, all those things the insurance companies are paying out for. And then you add an accident into that, and the last accident that I can think of on a vessel, which was they hit a diver, they hit 2 divers, was around $35 million. That was the payout on that thing. Insurance companies are going to keep raising those rates, which just means there's less vessels operating. So less for us divers to use to go out there. So until we can improve this culture and make them start thinking about these things, it's not going to get any better. So we have to do something. We have to take an initiative to, as Aaron said, as a consumer, you're stepping on board a vessel, look for those stickers, ask for those credentials. Is this a credible person? I've had boat operators call me and say, I don't want to take CCR divers out. What should I do to make sure that I don't have an accident on my boat with that? The one thing I would do for every CCR diver, I'd have them pull the head off and check the cells, the O2 cells in there, and look at the expiration dates. Have them tell you when that cell expires. Because I can tell you that we average anywhere between 24 and 26 CCR fatalities per year. Out of those 24 to 26 CCR fatalities, those O2 sensors are anywhere from 3 to 5 years old. And they're only supposed to be good for 12 months. Maximum.
On a sidebar, do you think that contributes to a lot of deceased? Like, that's a large fraction of the CCR fatalities is simply caused by older expired sensors?
I don't know. It's hard to tell. I can tell you that the stuff that I read on the internet is way far more technical than what the actual core issue is. And you're probably right. I will also say this, and I'm not aligned with any one manufacturer. I have almost never seen where equipment failed. I have seen where equipment failed due to lack of maintenance, where O2 cells were too old, where scrubbers were packed too far in advance or exhausted and continue to be used. But I have never seen or a unit was modified. Someone's drilled a hole through the side of something and decided to plumb in a new sensor or computer system or something, and then it caused a flood. So I have seen all of that. But
Not a catastrophic failure of the equipment.
Correct, exactly. Yeah. But that would be something I would do. If I was a boat operator and was worried about CCR divers on it, I'd say, pop the head off of that thing and let me see those cells and make sure they're within date. Or when did you pack that canister? Because if you pack that canister when you left your home 700 miles ago and now it's all caked up inside of there, I'd rather not see that. Yes?
Is there opportunity to create, insurance often, practically speaking, supersedes regulations, to create, like with Chapman or something, a voluntary program for dive boat operators that sets a more rigorous set of standards than just the core Coast Guard small passenger standards that would have some sort of audit path, so a boat operator could go I'm a Chapman certified operator, which means my crew is been checked and they're getting their 90-day training, and we get audited and we have our equipment, and we have this, that, and the other, and we have our plans as a potential avenue to pursue to try and bring the insurance rates down, where insurance companies might be able to go, all right, if you got this, that gives us some assurance that you're, less likely to do something stupid and negligent.
So I guess my question back would be is, to this group, since we got such a great group here, what is the demand signal for something like that? How many people would want to go through, like, say, a dive boat operations type course? And I'm not talking weeks and weeks and weeks, right? We can, it could be something that's just a couple days. Is that something that there would be a demand for? I mean, I would just, those of you that are, operator-owned boats, I mean,
if we can bring insurance rates down, so
Yeah.
absolutely.
One thing to note, though, is the Conception was certified as a pass by the Coast Guard.
I'm glad you bring that up. That there is also, though, part of it is, that was an older boat, and it got waived because the operator pushed for a waiver. And if you remember on that, that was it had, because each, passenger or sleeping compartment has to have 2 exits. They both exited into that main salon. Part of that vessel's inspection, or COI, certificate of inspection, was that it had to have a live fire watch. A crewman had to remain awake and roaming to watch out for fires. Because of that. That was identified and that was in there. And then the captain said, oh, I thought just letting them sleep in the pilot house met the requirements. Right? So that was, that was an error there, right? That was, kind of a negligent approach to keeping people safe. So, part of that, yes, it's like, because then the regulations changed. That boat was built so long before the new regulations that it couldn't be easily reconfigured. So it was yeah, you're right. It was grandfathered in. It would not have been approved today, but then people always want this grandfather. It's like, sometimes it's demand high, better standards, better safety standards, but it's like, but not for the one I've got. Just for the others, because I'm responsible. I go back, that's a good lesson. It's like going through, approaching the boats, our boats with a critical eye. And not just sometimes, and I've seen that with training, with maintenance, we kind of just pencil whip it, and say, our fire extinguisher's good, and you're like, yeah, I see 3, and we sign them off. Did we actually go over? Did we check the gauges? Did we do that? Life jackets, especially, we got 10. Have I pulled them to see, to make sure that they're still serviceable and looking at them? But I think there is room for something like a dive boat operations course, and I would think it not just be for captains, but open with crews as well. And it can't, I think it, my take on it, and it'd be interesting to hear your take, is I don't think it can just be like we'll call it a knowledge base, right? Just an online only course. I think we have to have some kind of practical, hands-on, experience where we actually get out there on a boat and maybe run through the drills and do these different exercises. Have bringing somebody back on board and then running through from start to finish, because that's also one of my background with the drills is like we do a fire drill. Fire. We go out and we pretend to spray water and we're like, fire's out in 3 seconds. That's not how fires work unless you get it early, So, making sure we run through, we don't just bring them on board and like, whew, saved him. Oh, we haven't even looked to see if he's breathing, And then what do? We run through. Now we got to do CPR. We got to start running through the whole gamut of it. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, guys. Appreciate your time, and thank you for the questions.
Thank you.
Thanks.